The chandeliers glowed above the grand hall, their light bouncing off the polished marble floor. Guests whispered among themselves as they watched the billionaire's son walk beside his father. The boy was small, dressed neatly in a red vest, his eyes sharp and observant despite his age. The father, tall and serious, guided him toward the center where a line of glamorous models waited. Each one stood in perfect posture, wearing elegant gowns that shimmered under the golden lights. They smiled, posed, and adjusted their hair, ready to be chosen. The father's voice carried across the room. He spoke with pride, but also with pressure. He told his son this was the moment to make a choice that would define his life. He explained that among these women stood the possibility of beauty, wealth, and status. The boy listened quietly, his small hands folded behind his back. Everyone expected him to pick one of the models. The women represented success, power, and everything his father valued. But the boy's expression stayed unreadable, his eyes moving past the glittering dresses and jewels dotting the corner of the hall. Standing away from the line was the maid. She wore a simple black and white uniform, holding a folded towel against her chest. She had been ordered to serve during the gathering, nothing more. Her hair was tied neatly, and her presence was meant to be invisible among the grandeur. Yet the boy's eyes lingered on her. She seemed startled to even be noticed. Her gaze dropped to the floor when their eyes met, unsure if she had made a mistake by standing too close. The boy turned back toward his father, who urged him to step forward. The crowd leaned closer, eager for the choice. Whispers grew louder. As the models adjusted their smiles, each one silently confident that she would be the one. They had practiced this moment in their minds, each imagining the honor of being chosen in such a powerful household. Cameras flashed, capturing every movement, every glance. But instead of walking toward the line of women, the boy lifted his hand and pointed. Gasps filled the hall. Every model stiffened, their smiles faltering. The father's face tightened, unsure if he had understood. The boy's finger was not aimed at the models in their expensive gowns. It was aimed at the maid. The maid froze, her lips parting in shock. The towel nearly slipped from her hands. She had no words, no way to respond to what had just happened. Around her, whispers turned into a storm of disbelief. The guests could not understand what they had just witnessed. The models exchanged quick, embarrassed glances, some stepping back as though insulted. The father's jaw clenched, his hand gripping his son's shoulder, but the boy did not lower his finger. His voice came clear, stronger than expected for his age. "Please, be my mom." The room fell into silence. For a long moment, no one breathed. The words echoed against the tall walls, impossible to ignore. The maid blinked, her eyes wide with confusion. She shook her head slightly, unsure if she had heard correctly. The father's face hardened, but he said nothing. The guests could not look away, each person caught between disbelief and curiosity. The models' carefully built confidence shattered. Their eyes darted between one another, searching for explanations, but none made sense. They had prepared for admiration, but they now stood ignored. The boy's choice had erased all their beauty in an instant. And the maid, someone who had never expected to be seen, now stood at the center of attention. The father leaned closer to his son, his voice low but firm. He asked if this was a joke, if the boy understood the weight of his words. The boy looked up at him calmly, his gaze steady. He repeated what he had said, with no hesitation. The maid's hands trembled as she clutched the towel, her heart racing. She whispered that she was only a servant, not someone who belonged in the place the boy was offering. But the boy did not flinch. He stepped closer, his small hand reaching toward her. The guests could see the determination in his eyes. He was not choosing wealth or power or glamour. He was choosing something different, something no one else could see. The father's expression shifted, caught between anger and disbelief. His authority, his plan was unraveling before everyone. Silence of the room turned into murmurs again, louder this time. People whispered about the boy's strange choice, about what it meant. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads. But a few, just a few, watched with curiosity. They wondered if the boy saw something no one else dared to see. The maid swallowed hard, unable to step away. Her instincts told her to refuse, to apologize, to vanish into the background as she had always done. But her heart trembled in a way it never had before. The boy's words had reached a place inside her that she thought had long been locked away. She stared at him, her lips unable to form a reply. The father's eyes burned with frustration. But he could not undo what had been said. The boy had spoken, and everyone had heard. The silence in the hall finally broke when the father's voice thundered across the marble walls. His words were sharp, filled with anger. He demanded to know why his son would embarrass him in front of so many guests. The boy did not flinch. He stood his ground, his finger still pointing at the maid. His small body trembled, but his voice stayed steady. He repeated the same words again. "Please, be my mom." The models shifted uncomfortably, their faces stiff with forced smiles. Their confidence had turned into nervous pride. Some of them whispered to each other, mocking the boy's choice. Others tried to act unbothered, though the sting of being rejected in favor of a maid burned deep. Guests leaned close, exchanging shocked remarks. Cameras clicked again, capturing every reaction, every frown, every tear in the maid's eyes. The maid stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind raced with fear. She had never spoken against her employers, never once raised her voice or opinion. She had always stayed invisible, her role simple: clean, serve, and disappear into the background. But now, the boy's words dragged her into the center of a storm. She clutched the towel tighter, her fingers trembling, and whispered softly that he was mistaken. The father grabbed his son's arm firmly and pulled him back. His voice lowered, meant only for the boy, but the anger was clear. He told him that this was not the time for childish games, that life was not built on feelings but on power, wealth, and image. He pointed at the line of models, their elegant gowns glittering under the golden light, and told him these women represented the future. But the boy's eyes never moved from the maid. His grip on his father's arm was small, but it carried a silent strength that refused to break. The maid felt her chest tighten. She wanted to escape, to run from the weight of all those eyes. She had never been dressed like the models, never touched the luxuries of their world. She did not belong here, and everyone knew it. She shook her head and whispered again that she was not worthy. But the boy's words came once more, louder this time, cutting through the whispers of the hall. He said she was the only one who ever cared for him. He said she listened when others ignored him. He said she was kind. Guests gasped again, their whispers growing louder. The father's face turned pale, his authority threatened in his own house. He barked orders for the maid to step back, to leave the hall immediately, but the boy moved in front of her, his small arms outstretched as if to shield her. It was a sight no one expected. The billionaire's son protecting the maid from his own father. The models tried to recover their poise. Some laughed lightly, as if to dismiss the boy's words as childish nonsense. Others sneered at the maid, their eyes sharp with disdain. They whispered cruel remarks under their breath, certain she would be punished once the event ended. The maid felt the sting of those looks, her heart beating fast. But when she glanced down at the boy standing in front of her, she saw his determination. His eyes were steady, his chin lifted. The father's voice grew louder, his anger spilling over. He accused the maid of manipulating his son, of planting foolish ideas in his head. The maid shook her head quickly, her voice trembling as she insisted she had done no such thing. She explained that she had only ever served quietly, that She had never dreamed of such attention. But the father's fury blinded him. He raised his hand as if to call the guards, but the boy's sudden shout stopped him. "Don't touch her!" The boy cried, his small voice carrying more power than expected. The hall fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. The father froze, his hand hovering mid-air, stunned by the force in his son's tone. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, his face red with emotion, but his eyes never wavered. He repeated the words again, clear and undeniable. "I want her to be my mom." The guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between shock and curiosity. Some whispered that the boy had lost his mind. Others murmured that perhaps he saw something they could not. A few even admired the boy's courage, though they dared not say it aloud. The models tried to smile again, but their eyes betrayed their bitterness. The maid's hands trembled, tears filling her eyes as she realized the boy's choice was not a mistake. He had chosen her, fully and without hesitation. The father lowered his hand slowly, his face cold. His jaw tightened as he realized that forcing his son now, in front of so many witnesses, would not only humiliate the boy but also stain his own image. He turned away sharply, signaling the end of the gathering. The guests exchanged puzzled glances, their whispers filling the air like a storm. The models stepped back, their smiles fading completely. The maid stood in silence, still unable to move, still clutching the towel against her chest. The boy turned to her, his expression softening. He whispered gently, asking her not to be afraid. He promised he would not change his choice, no matter what others said. The maid's lips trembled, but no words came out. She simply stared at him, her heart torn between fear and something she could not yet name. Asterisk. The next morning, the mansion was filled with whispers. Servants moved carefully through the halls, glancing at the maid whenever she passed. Their voices dropped to murmurs, their eyes sharp with judgment. They had all heard what happened in the great hall. They knew the boy had chosen her in front of everyone, and they could not hide their curiosity or their resentment. The models, still staying as guests in the mansion, gathered in the garden. Their laughter was loud, but their words cut deep. They spoke of how ridiculous it was for a child to choose a maid over women of beauty and status. Some mocked her simple clothes and quiet ways. Others sneered that she must have used pity to catch his attention. They called her undeserving, and their words carried easily through the open windows where the servants worked. The maid heard every one of them, though she tried to keep her head down and continue her duties. The boy, however, was not silent. He appeared in the garden unexpectedly, his small shoes crunching on the gravel path. The models stopped laughing when they saw him, though their smiles returned quickly, false and polished. They bent low, speaking sweetly, trying to draw him near. But the boy's face was serious. He told them plainly that their words were cruel and that they should stop speaking of the maid with such disrespect. The models exchanged uneasy glances. Some tried to laugh it off, saying he was only a child who did not understand. But the boy stood firm, his voice carrying a weight far beyond his years. He told them the maid had shown him more care in her silence than all their polished smiles combined. His words stunned them, leaving the garden in awkward silence. He turned and walked away, leaving them speechless and angry. Inside the mansion, the father sat in his study, staring at reports and phone calls that would not stop coming. News of the boy's choice had spread far beyond the walls of the mansion. Headlines questioned the strange decision, and business partners whispered about the billionaire losing control of his household. The father's jaw clenched as he listened. He had spent years building a name of power and control, and now his son's defiance had shaken that image. He called the maid into his study. She entered nervously, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The father's eyes were cold as he asked her what she had done to win his son's loyalty. She shook her head quickly, explaining that she had done nothing beyond her duty. She had cleaned, she had served, and nothing more. She insisted that she never sought his son's attention. Her voice trembled, but her honesty shone through. Father leaned forward, his voice low. He told her that she was a servant and nothing else, and that she should remember her place. He warned her not to encourage the boy, not to mistake his childish words for truth. The maid bowed her head, her heart heavy, but before she could answer, the boy's voice came from the doorway. He had followed her into the study, and his small frame stood in the shadow of the great door. He declared that his choice was not a mistake. He said he wanted the maid because she made him feel safe, because she treated him like a person and not a prize. The father's face darkened, but the boy's eyes held steady. The maid turned, startled, her heart pounding as she watched the boy stand against his father once again. The father dismissed the maid harshly, ordering her to leave. She bowed quickly and hurried out, her breath shaking. But the boy chased after her, his small hand catching her sleeve in the corridor. He told her not to be afraid, that he would not change his mind no matter what anyone said. Tears filled her eyes, though she tried to hide them. She whispered that he was too young to understand the trouble he was causing, but the boy shook his head firmly. He told her he understood more than anyone thought. That evening, when the servants gathered in the kitchen, the maid sat alone in a corner. She could hear their whispers, the way they mocked her behind their hands. They said she was reaching above her station, that she would bring nothing but shame to herself and the household. Her hands trembled as she folded cloths, her heart heavy with the weight of their words. But then the boy entered the kitchen, surprising everyone. He walked directly to her table and sat beside her. The servants froze, their laughter dying instantly. The boy looked at them calmly and said that anyone who disrespected her disrespected him. The words carried a power that silenced the entire room. The maid felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging with tears she could no longer hold back. She lowered her face, covering her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed by his courage. The servants quickly returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere had changed. The boy's loyalty was unshaken, his protection clear. The maid sat in silence, her heart torn between fear of the storm growing around her and a warmth she had not felt in years. For the first time, she began to wonder if his choice was not just a child's whim, but something far deeper, something that no wealth or beauty could replace. The mansion grew heavier with tension in the days that followed. The boy's choice was no longer just a whisper inside the halls, it had spread into the city. Newspapers carried the story, and headlines painted the incident as both scandal and drama. Some praised the boy for seeing beyond wealth, but many ridiculed the idea. They questioned how a maid could ever belong in the world of billionaires. The father, sitting in his tall office, read the words with growing fury. His reputation was built on strength and power, not weakness and sentiment. He decided to act. Late one night, he summoned the head of the staff and gave a single order. The maid was to be dismissed. No reason needed, no questions asked. Papers were prepared quickly, her quarters emptied without her knowing. She would be gone by morning, and with her gone, the father believed the problem would disappear. But the boy heard. He had a way of slipping past guards and servants, listening to doors half open, catching words not meant for him. When he heard that the maid would be sent away, he ran through the halls until he found her. She was in the laundry room, folding sheets, unaware of what awaited her. His chest rose and fell as he told her what he had heard. She froze, her hands gripping the sheets tightly, her face pale. She shook her head, whispering that it was better this way. She told him he did not understand, that her place had never been by his side, but always in the shadows. Tears filled her eyes as she begged him to let go of his choice, to let her leave in peace. But the boy's voice came firm, almost fierce. He told her he would not allow it, that she belonged with him, no matter what anyone said. The next morning, when the guards arrived at her door to escort her out, they found the boy sitting cross-legged in front of it. His small arms were folded, his eyes stubborn and unmovable. They tried to coax him away, reminding him that his father's orders could not be questioned, but he did not move. He told them that if they took her away, they would have to take him to. The scene drew the attention of the entire household. Servants lined the corridors, whispering in shock. The models, dressed in their elegant clothes, appeared at the top of the stairs, their expressions filled with disbelief. Even the father himself stepped forward, his anger clear on his face. He demanded that the boy move, that he stop this foolishness at once. But the boy shook his head and pressed his back harder against the maid's door. The maid opened it slowly from behind, her eyes red from tears. She told him softly to stand up, that she could not allow him to ruin his future for her. But the boy refused. His small voice rose again, carrying through the hall with surprising strength. He said she was already his family in his heart, and that no paper or order could change that. The father's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. The guests who had gathered watched in silence, their hearts caught between pity and admiration. No one had ever dared to stand against the billionaire in his own house, not even seasoned businessmen. Yet his son stood there, unshaken, for the sake of a maid. Finally, the father gave a sharp command, and the guards stepped back. He dismissed everyone with a glare, leaving only himself, the boy, and the maid in the corridor. His voice was low, dangerous, as he told the boy that this obsession would destroy everything. He reminded him of the world outside these walls. A world that would not accept weakness, a world that respected power and wealth. The boy listened silently, then looked up at his father and asked a question that silenced him. What is power if it cannot protect the ones we love? The words pierced the air like a blade. The father's eyes widened, caught off guard by the question. He had spent years teaching his son about power, about control, but never expected those lessons to turn against him. The maid stood frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard the boy's words. She wanted to tell him to stop, to protect himself, but her voice failed. The father turned away sharply, unable to answer. He ordered the maid to return to her duties, and the boy to his room, his voice cold but shaken. The guards withdrew, the corridor slowly emptying. The boy stayed by the maid's side, holding her hand quietly as they walked back to her quarters. She tried to tell him again that he should not fight for her, but he only squeezed her hand tighter. That night, when the mansion grew quiet, the maid sat alone on her small bed. She thought of the boy's words, of his courage, and her heart trembled. She had lived her life in shadows, believing she had no worth beyond her chores. But now, for the first time, someone had chosen her above all others. Not for beauty, not for status, but for kindness. It frightened her, but it also lit something inside her, something she had buried long ago. In his room, the boy stared at the ceiling, his fists clenched against the sheets. He knew the battle was not over. His father would not stop, and the world outside would not accept his choice. But his mind was clear, his resolve unshaken. He had chosen her, and nothing would make him turn away. The story of the boy's defiance did not stay hidden within the mansion. By the end of the week, it had spread across the city and into the screens of millions. News anchors debated the meaning of his choice, while headlines flashed bold words about the billionaire's son rejecting models for a maid. Social gatherings buzzed with gossip, business partners questioned the family's image, and critics mocked the idea as foolishness. Everywhere the father turned, the boy's decision followed him like a shadow he could not shake. The models, who had once carried themselves with pride inside the mansion, began to show open disdain toward the maid. They whispered cruel words in her presence, no longer bothering to hide their contempt. Some laughed at her simple clothes. Others accused her of stealing the boy's innocence with pity. They posed in front of cameras, their perfect smiles masking their bitterness, while reporters compared them to the plain maid who captured the boy's heart. The humiliation burned them deeply, and their whispers grew sharper each day. Inside the mansion, the father tried to regain control. He met with advisors who urged him to silence the scandal quickly. They suggested replacing the maid in secret, or sending the boy away to study abroad where the story would fade. But the father's pride fought against the idea of running. He could not allow the world to think his son's will outweighed his own. His voice shook with anger as he promised he would crush the story, no matter what it took. The maid, however, bore the weight of the storm most heavily. She walked the halls with lowered eyes, the whispers of servants stinging her ears. At night, she cried quietly in her small room, afraid of what each morning would bring. She knew the father's anger, she knew the model's hatred, and she feared the growing storm outside. She wanted to leave, to slip away unnoticed, but every time she thought of it, she remembered the boy's words. His small voice echoed in her heart, reminding her that he saw her as family. And though fear pressed down on her, a part of her refused to abandon him. One evening, a formal dinner was arranged with important guests. Business partners, politicians, and members of high society gathered around the long table, their eyes sharp and curious. The father sat at the head, his expression carved from stone. The boy sat near him, silent but watchful. The maid was ordered to serve, her presence meant to be invisible. But as she moved quietly, the whispers began. Guests leaned close to one another, commenting on the scandal, on the maid's appearance, on the strange choice of the boy. Their words were not soft enough to be hidden. The boy's fists clenched under the table. His eyes burned as he listened to their laughter, their sharp tongues tearing at the one person he had chosen. Finally, unable to bear it, he stood. His small hands pressed against the edge of the table, his voice cutting through the chatter. He told them to stop. He told them she was not a joke, not a shadow, but someone who mattered. His words echoed against the high ceilings, silencing the entire hall. The guests stared in disbelief, their eyes wide at the sight of a child daring to challenge them. The father's face hardened, his jaw tight with rage, but he did not stop his son. The boy's words carried a strength that could not be dismissed. He said that wealth and beauty meant nothing if it lacked kindness, and that he would rather stand with the maid than with all the gold in the world. The hall fell quiet, the boy's small voice lingering in the silence. The maid stood frozen at the edge of the room, tears brimming in her eyes. She had never been defended like this, never been seen as more than a servant. Her hands trembled as she gripped the tray, her heart racing with emotion she could not contain. She wanted to disappear, yet she also wanted to hold on to that moment forever. After the dinner, when the guests had gone, the father confronted his son in the study. His voice was sharp, filled with fury. He told him he was making a fool of himself, of the family, and of everything they stood for. But the boy did not back down. He repeated again that his choice was final, that no amount of anger could change it. His words left the father speechless once more, unable to bend his will. The maid stood outside the door, listening, her heart torn apart by the fight. She wanted to rush in and tell the boy to stop, to protect himself, but her feet would not move. She pressed her back against the wall, tears running down her cheeks. She realized then that this was no longer about a choice made in innocence. The boy had chosen her not by accident, not by mistake, but because he believed in something greater than the world around them. That night, as the mansion fell silent, the boy slipped from his room and went to the maid's quarters. He sat beside her small bed, his eyes tired but determined. He told her not to be afraid, that he would stand for her until the end. She looked at him through tearful eyes, her voice breaking as she whispered that he deserved more than she could ever give. But he shook his head firmly, repeating the same words he had spoken since the first day. "I choose you." The maid held her face in her hands, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. The storm outside the mansion was growing, and she knew the final test was yet to come. But in that moment, sitting beside the boy who refused to abandon her, she felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. The storm could no longer be contained. By the end of the week, the boy's choice had become more than a household scandal. It had become a story carried by every news channel, every paper, every whisper in the city. Crowds gathered outside the gates of the mansion, some mocking, some praising, and others simply curious. For the first time, the father's control over how the world saw him was slipping, and nothing seemed strong enough to stop it. Inside, the pressure grew unbearable. The models, once confident in their beauty, began leaving one by one. They had no interest in being humiliated further, their pride unable to withstand the sting of being ignored in favor of a maid. They left in sleek cars, their gowns hidden under coats, their faces twisted with bitterness. The halls that once rang with their laughter fell silent, leaving only servants and the maid, who still tried to keep herself invisible despite the storm around her. The father, however, could not ignore what had become of his house. His son had stood against him, against society, and still did not waver. Every attempt to silence the boy only gave him more strength. Every harsh word only made him firmer. The father watched him closely, searching for weakness, but what he saw unsettled him more than anything. He saw determination. He saw courage. And he saw something he himself had lost long ago. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the house glowed in the soft light of chandeliers, the father called for a gathering. He ordered the staff, the remaining guests, and his son to meet in the great hall. The maid, too, was summoned, though she trembled as she walked the long path to the center. She feared this would be the moment of her dismissal, the moment the boy would finally lose. The father stood tall at the head of the hall, his voice strong and cold as he addressed them. He spoke of family, of power, of how choices shape destiny. His words were heavy, his tone sharp, but then he paused. His gaze swept across the room, landing on the boy. For a long silence, the hall waited. Then he asked his son once more if he understood what his choice meant. The boy stepped forward without hesitation. His voice was small, but steady, carrying across the room with surprising strength. He said he understood. He said he did not care for gold or jewels or the shallow smiles of those who only wanted to stand beside him for status. He said the maid had given him more love in silence than all the wealth in the world ever had. His words fell heavy, breaking the silence, and no one dared to move. The maid's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She shook her head gently, whispering that she did not deserve such words, that she was just a servant. But the boy turned to her, his expression firm. He told her she was not just anything. She was the one he wanted, and no one could take that away from him. The father's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked at his son, at the maid, and at the silence that hung over the hall. He saw the faces of his staff, their eyes wide with anticipation, their breaths held. And for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. The boy had shown courage he himself had forgotten. The maid, though trembling, had shown humility and strength. Together, they had faced ridicule and shame, yet neither had broken. At last, the father spoke. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of its thunder, but heavy with meaning. He said that though he could not understand his son's choice, he could not deny it. He declared that if his son saw family where others saw nothing, then that truth would stand. The hall erupted in whispers, shock rippling through every corner. The maid gasped softly, her knees weak beneath her, while the boy's eyes shone with relief. The father stepped forward, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. His face remained stern, but his words carried a new weight. He told his son that power was not only measured in wealth or control, but in the courage to protect what one believed in. For the first time, he admitted his son had shown him something. He had forgotten that strength could come from love, not just fear. The boy turned to the maid, his small hand reaching for hers. She hesitated, trembling, but at last she let him take it. The warmth of his grip brought tears streaming down her face, tears she no longer tried to hide. She whispered that she would never forget his choice, that she would never abandon him. And in that moment, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she was worthy of being chosen. Outside the mansion, the story spread again, but it carried a different tone now. People spoke of the boy's courage, of the maid's quiet strength, of a family formed not by wealth or beauty, but by loyalty and love. Some mocked, yes, but others admired. And among those whispers, the boy's words lived on. Power meant nothing if it could not protect the ones we loved. In the mansion, life slowly shifted. The models never returned. The servants treated the maid with cautious respect, their whispers quieter than before. The father remained stern, but his silence no longer carried only anger, it carried reflection. And the boy, still small, still young but already strong, walked proudly beside the maid, unafraid of what the world thought, for he had chosen her, and nothing would change that.